Good evening. This is going to be my first episode of Just the Tip, which for anyone that missed my Instagram posts earlier, well, yesterday, is going to just be some basic advice from me to other tattoo artists, mainly people that haven't been in the industry all that long. I've been tattooing for about 12 years now, and I've had my own shop for 10 of those. And in that time, I've met hundreds of other artists, had tons of guest artists come in. I've guested in tons of other people's studios. And I've learnt so much just from talking to other people that I thought it's probably worth me trying to share some of these little bits of knowledge with other people, I guess. So this is my first one, and it's really basic. It's just about how I apply a stencil to make sure it stays on nicely, it goes on crisply, and that there's no dramas with losing the stencil as you go through the tattoo process. It's very basic, but I hope you enjoy it. This is the design I'm going to be working with today. It's for my lovely client Jen, who's kindly said she'll help me out making this video. Okay, so the first thing I do when I'm making a stencil is to adjust the darkness on Photoshop. So I will usually just play around with curves a little bit, make it a little bit darker. And then I will adjust the gamma on the drawing, which also just makes it that little bit darker, which does really help when you're making a stencil. At this point, because this is a very large piece, I'm going to need to make two stencils, one of the top part, because I only have an A4 stencil maker. So I'll make one of the top half of the design. I'll crop that and I will print it off at whatever sort of size I want. For the purpose of this video, I'm just going to keep it at the size it's at. And then I will crop the bottom half, slightly overlapping the top half, and then print that off, making sure that it's still the same percentage. And then what you're left with is two halves of a stencil that I'm going to make two separate stencils from and stitch them together, and I'll show you how I do that in a minute. Before I actually make my stencil though, I need to check that the size is right next to the piece I did for Jen last year, this lovely mermaid babe. It looks a little bit big to me, so I'm going to just shrink it a smidge, just make it a little bit smaller so it sits nicely with her. My two parts of my stencil, 1 and 2. And once I've cut my stencils out, I overlap them, line them up a little bit. I take very small bits of tape and very carefully just tape in the overlapping areas, and then I'll cut off the excess from behind. And put some more very small bits of tape. You don't want to put too much tape on it, because when I stick the stencil on, I want it to be flexible enough, and I also want to be able to dab my Dettol over the top of it to make sure it's all stuck down, and if there's too much tape, it won't go through the tape because it's not porous. And so that is my stitched together stencil, slightly bigger than A4. So this is all the things that I use for making a stencil. Obviously the stencil, gloves, razor, skin pen. I have alcohol gel, isopropyl, Dettol, green soap with witch hazel, and talcum powder! And I will explain what all of those things are for next. First things first, ladies and gents, if you have long hair, always tie it up, even just when you're putting the stencil on. It bothers me massively when I see people applying stencils, tattooing, and their hair's all flip-flopping around. Hairs up. Okay, so first of all, I've sterilised my own hands with alcohol gel. First I glove up and then I apply isopropyl alcohol to the skin to sterilise it and remove any product or grease that is potentially on the customer's skin. I rub the skin quite hard because I like to make sure I'm getting rid of any dead skin that's on the surface as well, because that can also make it tricky to get the stencil to stick. So once I have alcoholed the skin, I give it a quick once over with green soap, because alcohol, as most of you know, also removes stencils, so it's best not to have huge amounts of alcohol actually on the skin when you put the stencil on. So now that Jen's leg is nice and clean and hair-free, I am pretty old school and I still use Dettol. So if you can stand just with your legs together. And I like to really soak the skin, be cold, sorry. I like to really soak the skin with a good squirt of Dettol first, and then sort of rub it in with my fingers, make sure I've worked it all into the skin nicely. I guarantee I'll put the stencil on, it'll be shit. So either way. Make sure I'm covering all the areas that I'm going to be applying the stencil to. A lot of people use stencil sticking products these days, and I have tried many of them. I just still prefer Dettol. A lot of people think I'm weird for that, but you can still apply the same principles whether you're using a stencil product or whether you're using Dettol. It all works pretty much the same. So when I'm matching something up, it's not a completely symmetrical mirror image of the other one, so it's never going to be entirely symmetrical. I do everything by eye, so I'm just going to try and get them in similar places, and there's a chance I might draw some extra bits on once I've lined them up and got the stencil on. So try not to touch the back of your stencil like I just did there, because I've now got a smudge on his face. Such a pro. And I usually try and get the centre of the stencil in first. Press that to the skin gently. And then I smooth out from the centre out to try and avoid any folds or creases in the paper as you go. The thing I like about Dettol as well is that it's wet, so the stencil actually does cling to the skin quite nicely. Okay, and once I've got it on in a position I'm happy with, that looks pretty good, but we don't really know until I take it off. I'll always make sure I give it a really good press to the skin. Try and get your other hand on the opposite side, because it's so important to get a good stencil. The tattoo is only ever going to be as good as the stencil, unless you're a miracle worker like some of these incredibly talented artists are. And I think for me the number one thing to remember is that the stencil needs to dry a bit on the skin. And something I do that I don't think a lot of other tattoo artists do is I use baby powder. So I will give a light sprinkle of that just over the top of the tattoo of the stencil itself, because it will soak up some of the moisture from the Dettol and help the stencil to dry. Onto the skin nicely. I'll then leave the stencil drying on the skin for at least 30 to 40 seconds. Very carefully peel the stencil off, trying not to smudge it too much as I go. That looks to me like it's on there. The final step for me is leaving the stencil on the skin to dry for at least 3 to 5 minutes before you start tattooing. Then when I'm working, I always start at the bottom and I work my way up the tattoo to avoid losing the stencil. I map out the bulk of the line work first, and then I go back through after to put in all of the small details, like the fine lines in the hair and the little flicks in the crow and things. This was as far as we got today, and it took around 5.5 hours.